For decades, the US dollar was the undisputed king of global currencies. But now, dramatic changes are happening. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are making really big moves, which will enable them to become much less dependent on the US dollar in the years ahead. This is really bad news for us, because having the primary reserve currency of the world has enabled us to enjoy a massively inflated standard of living. Once we lose that status, our lifestyles will be much different than they are today. Unfortunately, most Americans don't understand any of this. Even though our leaders have treated the stability of our currency with utter contempt in recent years, most Americans just assume that the dollar will always reign supreme. Meanwhile, much of the planet is preparing for a future in which the US dollar will be far less important than it is right now. The following are 7 signs that global de-dollarization has just shifted into overdrive. Number 1. The BRICS nation account for over 40% of the total global population and close to 1/4 of global GDP. So the fact they're working to develop a new currency should greatly concern all of us. The deputy chairman of Russia's State Duma, Alexander Babakov, said on 30th of March that the BRICS bloc of emerging economies, that is, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is working on developing a new currency that will be presented at the organization's upcoming summit in Durban. The transition to settlements in national currencies is the first step. The next one is to provide the circulation of digital or any other form of a fundamentally new currency in the nearest future. I think that at the BRICS, the Leaders Summit, the readiness to realize this project will be announced. Such works are underway, Babakov said on the sidelines of the Russian-Indian Strategic Partnership for Development and Growth Business Forum. Babakov also stated that a single currency could likely emerge within BRICS, and this would be pegged to not just the value of gold, but also to other groups of products, rare earth elements, or soil. Several nations in West Asia and North Africa have expressed interest in joining the bloc, including Saudi Arabia and Algeria. Last year, Iran officially applied to join BRICS. Earlier this month, South African Foreign Minister Nadeli Pandor revealed that global interest in BRICS is huge, adding that she had 12 letters from interested countries on her desk, including the UAE, Egypt, Argentina, Mexico, and Nigeria. The news of a possible BRICS currency comes as a growing number of nations across the world are moving away from conducting trade in US dollars as a result of Washington's policy of economic coercion. The US dollar plays a far too dominant role in global finance. Whenever the Federal Reserve Board has embarked on periods of monetary tightening or the opposite, loosening, the consequences on the value of the dollar and the knock-on effects have been dramatic. Number 2. 2 of the BRICS nations, China and Brazil, have just reached a deal to trade in their own currencies. The Chinese renminbi is speeding up in expanding its global use, a trend that will help build a more resilient international monetary system, one that is less dependent on the US dollar, more conducive to trade growth, experts said on Thursday. They commented after China and Brazil, 2 major emerging economies and BRICS members, reportedly reached a deal to trade in their own currencies, ditching the US dollar as an intermediary. The deal will enable China and Brazil to conduct their massive trade and financial transactions directly, exchanging the RMB for rials and vice versa instead of going through the dollar. Agence France-Presse reported on Wednesday, citing the Brazilian government. The financial sanctions adopted by the United States since the start of the Ukraine crisis have triggered a crisis of confidence for the dollar to some extent, boosting the global use of other currencies, including the renminbi, ZU, and on the sidelines of the Bell Forum for Asia annual conference. Number 3. During a meeting last week in Indonesia, finance ministers from the Asian nations discussed ways to reduce dependence on the US dollar, the euro, yen, and British pound. An official meeting of all Asian finance ministers and central bank governors kicked off on Tuesday, March 28th, in Indonesia. Top of the agenda, discussions to reduce dependence on the US dollar, euro, yen, and British pound from financial transactions, a move to settlements in local currencies. The meeting discussed efforts to reduce dependence on major currencies through the Local Currency Transaction Scheme, or the LCT. This is an extension of the previous Local Currency Settlement, LCS scheme, that has already begun to be implemented between Asean members. This means that an Asean cross-border digital payment system would be expanded further and allow Asian states to use local currencies for trade. An agreement on such cooperation was reached between Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, and Thailand, and that was in November 2022. This follows from Indonesia's banking regulator, starting on March 27th, that the Bank of Indonesia is preparing to introduce its own domestic payment system. Number 4. In a move that has enormous implications for the petrodollar, Saudi Arabia just agreed to become a dialogue partner in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The state-owned Saudi press agency said that, in a session presided by King Salman bin Abdulaziz, the Saudi cabinet on Tuesday approved a memorandum awarding Riyadh the status of dialogue partner in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a political security and trade alliance that lists China, Russia, India, Pakistan, and 4 other Central Asian nations as full members. The organization further tallies 4 observer states, including Iran, 9 dialogue partners, counting in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. It's headquartered in Beijing and served by China's Jiang Ming as Secretary General. Saudi Arabia's decision to join the SCO while falling short of full membership takes Riyadh's interests further east at a time when Beijing is testing out its sway in the Middle East in a potential hit to U.S. influence. In early March, China brokered a deal for long-time Mid-East rivals Saudi Arabia and Iran to resume diplomatic relations and reopen embassies in each other's countries. Number 5. The Chinese just completed their very first trade of liquefied natural gas that was settled in Chinese currency instead of US dollars. Chinese state oil and gas giant CNOOC and Total Energies completed the first LNG trade on the exchange with settlement in the Chinese currency, the exchange said in a statement carried by Reuters. The trade involved around 65,000 tons of LNG imported from the United Arab Emirates, the Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange added. China has been looking for years to establish more trade deals in yuan to increase the relevance of its currency on the global markets and challenge the US dollar's dominance in international trade, including in energy trade. Over the past year, Russia has turned to trade in yuan in the wake of the Western sanctions on its exports, imports, and energy trade, as the Chinese currency has become Putin's only alternative to reduce exposure to the US dollar and the euro. Number 6. India will offer its currency as an alternative for trade to countries that are facing a shortage of dollars in the wake of the sharpest tightening in monetary policy by the U.S. Federal Reserve in decades. Facilitating the rupee trade for countries facing currency risk will help disaster-proof them, Commerce Secretary Sunil Bathwal said during an announcement on India's foreign trade policy Friday in New Delhi. Number 7. Saudi Arabia has actually agreed to accept Kenyan shillings as payment for oil shipments to Kenya instead of US dollars. As the US currency exchange rate hit 145.5 shillings due to increased demand by importers, President Ruto accused oil cartels of stockpiling American dollars in response to the crisis, sparking fuel shortages throughout Kenya. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Egypt are facing dollar shortages and have shown interest to trade in the Indian currency, the government official later told reporters, declining to be identified, citing rules. A lack of dollars played a part in forcing Sri Lanka to default on its debt last year, while Bangladesh recently took a loan from the IMF to shore up its own reserves. India has been attempting to internationalize the rupee to reduce dollar demand and insulates its economy from global shocks. Officials have previously said that apart from Russia, countries in Africa and the Gulf region were also keen to trade in its local currency. 10 years ago, none of these things would have happened. But now, change is happening at a pace that is absolutely breathtaking. At this point, John Carney is warning that a fracturing of global currency reserves is, quote, inevitable, unquote. In fact, he continued, it's not only a serious threat, I think it's inevitable. The U.S. was the biggest economy in the world. In the 1970s, global banking became basically dollar central. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the entire world, more or less, came under the domination of the U.S. dollar. That is now drifting away. China and Russia are starting to build an alternative block of currency. Sadly, I agree with him. As U.S. relations with both Russia and China continue to go downhill, both of those nations will have a very strong incentive to push de-dollarization even further. And that is really bad news for the United States because our currency is the source of our economic power, and it is the most important thing that we export. This is a story of monumental importance. But unfortunately, most Americans still believe that our leaders know exactly what they're doing, and they have everything fully under control.